as I said, I'm going to make this brief and short and to the point. The reason I was put here is to make certain that, in fact, if we had a half an hour or an hour that had to be covered, I would cover it. And if we have 10 minutes, I'll cover that too. So that's the goal, is for me to keep on time. And so I'm going to go through and talk about what I think is one of the most significant challenges facing South Dakota agriculture and American agriculture as we go in the future. Can we learn from the past? Americans across the board are embarrassed at the failures of our manufacturing. As you walk down the aisles of our big box store, it seems that every item of merchandise that, in fact, you try to pick up and evaluate for purchase was either made in China, Japan, Mexico, Taiwan, someplace like that. For a long time, I've been gravely concerned about this and pondering this question very, very deeply. The most frequent explanation that's given to me is we just can't compete with the low labor costs of other nations, these underdeveloped nations. I've thought about that a long time, and I keep on asking the question, is it possible that part of the correct answer rests in our failure of our political and academic leadership to recognize the importance of newest technology? That really, really, really causes me concern. As I look around and I look at the successful companies, the Bobcats, the John Deeres, the Caterpillars, what is success? The success is that those guys have implemented this new technology at a very, very rapid rate. And the reason why they've done it is because they've had great leadership, and they've also had another advantage. They've had the capability within their own system of having these top-level scientists and engineers that weren't able to implement this kind of technology. That's really, really important. A question that I would ask is, why haven't many of our ma and pa organizations, smaller organizations, implemented the same technology? I was in a machine shop not too long ago, and there were no CNC machines. And it just bothered me greatly. Why have we not? And I talked to the guy that ran and owned the machine shop, and he said, nobody ever taught me that. And a question that we as Americans need to be asking is the problem we're seeing in manufacturing a result of this kind of problem? We invented it, we developed it, why aren't we using it? That's a question that I continue to ask. But what concerns me more greatly is that, is American agriculture following in the same footsteps as U.S. manufacturing? Precision agriculture is nothing other than CNC. That's all it is. Computerized, numeric controlled. And we need to be moving forward and developing it. The opportunities grow greater every year. They're just incredibly great. But in fact, are we doing the job that we ought to do as far as developing that? In some places we are, in other places we're not. This is a slide that I wish every one of you would learn, would know, would understand. If you look at an economy, be it a local economy, a state economy, or whatever, think of it as that bucket. And then ask the question, as you look at that bucket, what is the major source of input into that? If we're in South Dakota, there is but one answer to that question. It's production agriculture. It's very, very clearly that. As you look down below, we find that in that bucket we have all kinds of other activities. It's inside the bucket that you have your doctors and your lawyers and your plumbers and your teachers and your principals, etc. And they're turning and churning. And that's what creates gross domestic product. And then down at the bottom you have what I call leaks from the system. And there's where, in fact, you send your dollars to Davenport for John Deere, or you send them to St. Louis for Monsanto, or you send them someplace else. What's incredibly important is that anybody that understands this knows that the greatest opportunity to enhance and improve and develop that economy is to work on that pump up on the top rather than fighting about how the economy turns and churns in the bucket. And in fact, I would argue that incredibly few of our politicians understand what I just said. In South Dakota, what does that mean? It means that if I can increase the yield of an acre of corn by 10 bushel per acre on 4 million acres, that's 40 million bushels of corn. And at $5, that's $200 million of economic activity. And I would argue that we can do that. I would also argue that the greatest impairment to us doing that is what goes into that pump at the top. And we need to understand that our agricultural systems are information-based systems, information management. And it's by improving and understanding information. I mean, just the kind of things that Scott talked about a few minutes ago. If I could increase my soybean yields by 5 bushel per acre by putting my phosphorus fertilizer 1 inch below the seed, look how much impact that has on our economy. That's what I call priming that pump. It's research that does that. It's research that steps forward. And it's research that, in fact, we need to be very concerned about. Well, you're probably wondering, well, what does this mean? I talked about the kind of things. If we look at the amount of dollars that we're spending on soybean research, that's public money, on the 4 million acres. Yes, I said 4 million acres of corn and 4 million acres of soybeans. We got about 4 million of each, so I didn't make a mistake here, okay? It amounts to about 25 cents an acre. That's what we're presently spending on public research. I could make a lot of arguments about how much we ought to be spending, but I'm not going to go there. The question is, with that small investment, how are we going to do it? The answer is that we must have a public-private partnership. We must work with producers. We must do on-farm research to answer all these questions. And we need to develop through the Soybeans Association and through the Corn Growers Association, through the crop improvement. We need to get back into a mode where, in fact, for the future generations, we're developing leadership and making certain that American agriculture is #1 in the world, and making certain that what happened to our manufacturing structure doesn't happen to agriculture. And I would argue that, in fact, it's got to be guys like you that, in fact, do that. You have to understand the significance and importance of moving forward. When I talk about those kind of things, I especially think it needs to be the old guys. You know, old as dirt, what can I say? That push, and push very, very diligently, because we have to do this. I'm going to talk about what I'm talking about on-farm research, and I'm going to do it very, very briefly. I'm going to cover it in about 3 or 4 minutes, what I usually spend about half an hour talking about, because in fact, like Sharon said, I'm between you and food. That's dangerous. We typically describe input-output relationships as yield response curves. And these are things that we need to develop to determine what optimum is, what the best recommendation is. These are the things that are incredibly important that we work on developing. To determine the maximum economic return, there are 3 things that we need. Actually, you could argue there might only be 2. What we need to know is the shape of the yield response curve. We need to know the value of the input and the value of the output. The value of the input, if we're talking about seed, it would be the cost of seed. If we're talking about the value of the output, we're talking about the commodity price dollar per bushel. And if we talk about the shape of the yield response curve, that takes a great deal of work. Any of you have heard me talk about yield response curves, heard me say I never saw a yield response curve I ever believed, but never looked at yield response curve data that I didn't study. And that's true. And the reason I say that is because Mother Nature is going to do it to us always. And going to change the things that we're looking at. But in fact, we can get a very, very good idea of what that yield response curve looked like. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how do we determine the optimum population, and I used a corn example in this particular case where in fact we had planting population and yield. And we take that, and that develops into a yield response curve. And the question we have is, after we see that, how do we know what optimum is? We know that in fact we had assumption of our seed costing $3 per thousand. That's $240 a bag. That's in the ballpark. If in fact corn was at $6 a bushel, Valero the other day was a little over $6, so that's in the ballpark. If we change the input from 18,000 to 19,000 seeds per acre, it costs us $3, and we have a return of 24. That's a really, really good deal. On the other hand, if we went from 36 to 37,000 seeds, it costs us $3, and over here you can see that line is flat and we get nothing in return. That's not a very good deal. What we know is that when we went from 18 to 19,000, we had that 4 bushels that amounted to $24. We went from 36 to 37, we had 0 return, and that resulted in $0. And clearly there's a place in there where in fact the dollars in is equal to dollars out. And as we look at this, what we want to know is where that point is. And yes, that is a calculus equation, and I'm sorry, calculus is math, and math is a 4-letter word, and I can't do anything about it. Yeah, that one, it's too close to lunch. I always get some rise out of that one. But in fact, this is a simple solution. Now, if we take that same analysis and we look at a field where in fact I have a half-mile field, and I put strips, instead of going in plots, I put strips on a half-mile field across that area. And here you see those, and these are again corn populations. And if in fact I would go every 200 foot, I could get 13 yield response curves out of this. And what I would end up with is I would have a set of yield response curves that would show me very definitively that in fact I have different optimum populations for different yield potential. And if I did this over a number of years and developed a lot of these kind of results, I would end up with a recommendation curve. And that's what we do. And that's where it comes from. And that recommendation curve, how do you use it? Well, the way we use it is we have multiple years of yield response data that shows us what the average yield was at a particular place in the field. We go to this yield response curve, or this optimized yield response curve, and it tells you what in fact the planting population should be. And we use that. I say these are some of the most significant, important aspects that we need to be moving forward with. Let's take an example of this. If I have a field, and I have many fields in South Dakota that go from 100 bushel yield potential in one place where they have average over long periods of time with 100 bushel per acre. In another place I go to an area where in fact we have 200 bushel per acre. And at 140 bushel per acre, our recommendation would be someplace in the neighborhood of about 20,000 seeds. And at 200 bushel per acre, we'd go up to 36,000 seeds. And at $3 a bushel, that would be a $4 a thousand, that would be a $48 difference. Now, I've heard people say, well, don't worry about it. Industry is going to take care of that. If industry took care of that, they would result in lower planting populations and less seed sold. Do you believe that? These are things that we have to work together to accomplish. We can do these for a lot of different kinds of things. I believe the day is going to come when in fact we have high-priced biotech soybean seed, and we're going to be needing to know and understand on a site-specific management basis what optimum is. I believe that in fact for soybean production we ought to be looking at phosphorus, and I believe that in fact in some of our low-yielding portions of the field that our soil test levels should be kept higher than in the high-yielding portions of the field. That seems kind of strange, but if you think about it, it's not, because in fact we're talking about the ability of that soil to supply nutrient and water. In conclusion, and like I said, I shortened this up a very, very great deal. Input-output relationships that work on a continuum can be studied very, very effectively in whole farm, field strip trials. We need to be doing this. I talked about the examples of what we can do. Scott talked about some of the things. This is a tool that belongs in every farmer's toolbox. If you are interested in moving forward, my strongest recommendation is that every producer in every year have an area of the field where in fact your goal and objective is to grow the highest yield you possibly can grow. You say sometime that's not economically feasible. I say you're right. I call that tuition. But in fact, what happens when you do come across those management practices which make you significant money and that you can continuously use and move forward? You've raised the bar, and that's what we need to do. That's what our goal of growing 100 bushel per acre is about, raising the bar. With that, I'd like to thank our many cooperators that we work with, Corn Growers, Soybean Association, South Dakota Wheat, the Alliance of Site-Specific Providers that I work with, lots and lots of people that we work with and work cooperatively with.